Hello, welcome to the first video of our chapter 19 topic, which is blood. So this is the first chapter of the 3 chapters that cover the cardiovascular system. So that will be blood from chapter 19, the heart from chapter 20, and blood vessels and blood pressure from chapter 21. So we just got done with testing on special senses and endocrines. That was kind of our control systems. We've covered all of our neural and hormonal control mechanisms. Now we're going to lay some groundwork for our circulatory and distribution of oxygen and nutrients and getting rid of carbon dioxide and waste products. And so blood is the first part of that comprehension of the circulatory system, cardiovascular, so heart and blood vessels. But before we get into the details of the composition of blood, which is the topic of this video, just a note about the development of this body system. So this is the first body system to become fully functional in a developing embryo at only 3 weeks of gestation, which is pretty amazing. But the purpose for the cardiovascular system in an adult can be understood by why that development happens so early. So we all start off as a fertilized egg, right? So sperm egg meet, it's one fertilized cell that divides and then divides again and divides again. In those early stages, the cells that are in this big blob of cells can get their nutrients they need, get rid of their waste products via diffusion. So they're small enough that diffusion is an efficient way to do that exchange. But as that group of cells, the embryo turns into a fetus and grows, diffusion is no longer efficient. And so by week 3, the embryo is large enough that you can't rely on diffusion. It becomes inefficient for how large and how separate those deeper cells are from the surface of the amniotic fluid. So knowing that because this fully functional system is ready to go at week 3, kind of plays through the whole point of the cardiovascular system, where when we get to blood vessels, we'll see that we are crisscrossed with blood vessels, that no cell, with a few exceptions, but no cell is more than 2 cell distances away from a blood capillary, which is the smallest of blood vessels, allows for that exchange. We'll see this more in detail in chapter 21, but that's because we had the development of this cardiovascular system from the very beginning of all your fetal development, which is pretty darn cool. So also, before we jump into the composition of blood, just listed in the notes here, the functions of blood. So number 1, transportation of dissolved gases, nutrients, hormones, and metabolic wastes. So clearly blood is the medium in which all of these things get carried around the body. Number 2, regulating pH and ion concentrations in the blood. So there are chemical characteristics, ionic characteristics of the blood that help to maintain a very narrow range for acceptable blood pH levels. Restriction of body fluid loss at injury sites. So that's going to be our last topic we'll cover, which is hemostasis, blood clotting, basically. Number 4, defense against toxins and pathogens. This is going to be mainly the job of white blood cells within your body, and antibodies, which are made by those white blood cells. And then lastly, stabilization of temperature. Because our blood circulates all around our body tissues, it can help deliver some of that heat. Warm core temperatures, blood can go to warm extremities, or if it's on the flip side, if it's hot, your cooler blood from the extremities can go in and cool the core. So blood helps to regulate body temperature. All right, so those are kind of the introduction to the cardiovascular system a little bit, the blood and functions of the blood. So let's take a look at what is it? What's blood? Let's take a look at this composition. So we're going to start off on the left-hand side with this vial of whole blood. So if you've ever had to give blood or you donate blood, that's what they're pulling out of your vein. Usually you can get an arterial blood draw, which would be arterial blood. But for the most part, this whole blood can be separated, and that physically is done by a centrifuge. A centrifuge spins the blood really fast, and the heavier parts of the blood settle out to the bottom, and then the lighter parts of the blood get left on the top. So the bottom parts are what we call formed elements. So these are cellular things and platelets, because platelets are not full-on cells. So let's take a look at the breakdown of the formed elements and see what that consists of, which is about, I'm going to say 45, because that's the percentage your lab manual uses. It's within this range of 37 to 54, but just to make it easy, let's shoot around 45% of your whole blood is formed elements. Okay, so then of that 45%, the most of that 45% is red blood cells. 99.9% of your formed elements are red blood cells. So there's like a gazillion of them. Then we have the 0.1% is represented by white blood cells. These are your disease fighters and protectors. And then platelets, these are your clotting, part of your clotting process, part of the hemostasis. Okay, so that is the formed elements. And we're going to talk more in detail. We have a whole couple of videos on red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets as far as the hemostasis goes. So that's about 45% of your blood. So a little bit less than half is the formed elements, the actual cells and platelets. The other half is what we call plasma. And we're going to finish our percentage and just round that to about 55%. Again, it's in the normal range of 46 to 63. But on average, it's usually a tad bit higher. So I'm just gonna stick with the 45-55 so I don't have to keep listing the averages. So what else is in the plasma? So we have in this little box here, the plasma is broken down into plasma proteins, other solutes, and water. So of that 55%, most of that is water. 92% of your plasma is made up of water. About 7% are plasma proteins and 1% are other solutes. So now we can take a closer look at some of those other things. So these other solutes, about 1%, there's a lot that make up this 1%. So that means even though there's a lot of these things, quantity, diversity-wise, so there's a whole bunch of different electrolytes, a whole bunch of nutrients, a whole bunch of waste, there's not very much of each kind because it's only representing 1% of the plasma. But it's still very important to talk about them because without them, we would be in big trouble. So electrolytes. Electrolytes are pretty much anything that has a charge on them, so they're an ion. So the list: sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chlorine, bicarbonate, HPO4, SO4, I don't know the names of those ions, hydrogen phosphate and maybe sulfate. I don't know my chemistry terminology as good as I should. But these things help to maintain osmotic pressure, and those ions we just know are involved in a lot of cellular processes. Think action potentials, muscle contractions, those types of things. Nutrients, what you get out of food. So think sugars, fats, proteins, which are broken down into monosaccharides, fatty acids, amino acids, all of those types of things. And then waste products. What happens when we digest and catabolize all of those nutrients? We get waste products like urea, uric acid, creatinine, bilirubin, and ammonia ions. So those are the three things of this small little 1% of these other solutes. And then we have our plasma proteins, and I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on plasma proteins in the next slide, but we can just list them here: albumins, globulins, fibrinogen, and I'll talk more about this guy right here because the other three are going to show up on the next slide. Of those plasma proteins, right, so 100% of plasma proteins, less than 1% of those are what we call regulatory proteins, which we pretty much just did a whole chapter on. It's your hormones and some enzymes like renin, right? Renin-angiotensin mechanism. So enzymes, proenzymes like the angiotensinogen, and hormones. These are what we call regulatory proteins. The other three are albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen, and so we can take a look at that in a little bit more detail. All right, so of your plasma proteins, I'm not discussing that less than 1% regulatory proteins because they're so diverse. But of the remaining major categories, we have albumins, which is about 60% of your plasma proteins, so they're the most numerous. Globulins, about 35%, and fibrinogen is 4%. So fibrinogen is solely responsible for blood clotting. We'll see that in the hemostasis video. Albumins, this most abundant of our plasma proteins, does a couple jobs. We'll talk about osmotic pressure when we get into chapter 21. We'll kind of see albumin's role. And we've already seen albumins a little bit with hormone transport because if you remember, it helped to transport the T3, T3, T4 in the blood plasma. So as your thyroid gland secreted T3, T4 bound to thyroid binding globulin, and then albumins, transthyretin, transferrin. See, my brain's already off of chapter 18. I can't remember that detail. So those are albumins. So osmotic pressure and transport is kind of the major functions of albumins. Globulins are antibodies. So all the big talk about antibody production with trying to get COVID immunity and pretty much immunity for any disease are antibodies. Antibodies fall in this category of globulins. And then we also have transport globulins. So like thyroid binding globulin is what that is called because it falls under this globulin category. And then as I've already mentioned, fibrinogen is for clotting. So fibrinogen gets converted to fibrin, which is what we see here. All right, and so just a couple of things before I wrap up is talking about the plasma proteins. Most of these come from the liver. About 90% of your plasma proteins are made in the liver. The antibodies are produced by what we call plasma cells, which are differentiated lymphocytes, which are a type of a white blood cell. And then just looking at the notes, I forgot to just say some of these statistics about blood itself. Its temperature is a little bit higher than body temperature. So our normal body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. Blood runs about 38 degrees Celsius. So that slightly warmer overall temperature of the blood helps to distribute the heat around the body. It is about 5 times as viscous as water. So viscous is kind of the stickiness of it or the sliminess of it. So water has a viscosity of 1, I believe. And think of like molasses or maple syrup is going to be really viscous. And so blood is not quite like maple syrup, but it's not as runny as water. So it's a little bit, has some stickiness to it because of these ingredients, primarily the proteins and the red blood cells. Its pH is 7.4 on average. It ranges between 7.35 and 7.45. So it's a very narrow range to maintain, but our body does a really good job. And we'll be learning more about that by 233 when we learn about blood pH regulation in the urinary system. For total blood volume, males have about 5 to 6 liters of blood and females have about 4 to 5 liters. So just for discussion purposes, I usually just pick 5 liters because that's the low end for males and the high end for females, so it kind of crosses over. So we each have about 5 liters of blood circulating throughout our body. It's going to vary depending on body size as well. And that 5 liters is about 7% of your body weight. Again, your overall body size will change with that. So it does have a contribution to how much you actually weigh, about 7%. So if you weighed 100 pounds, you have 7 pounds of blood. All right, so that wraps up the composition of blood. I will see you next time for a discussion on red blood cells. Bye.